Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the conference. And as it approaches the end, I would just like to thank the organizers and sponsors and everyone involved, other speakers, and all of you. But I'll do this at the end anyway. My name is Jakub, and I'm a lead software engineer at SiriusXM. And over 10 years of working with Scala, I've started countless side projects, libraries, videos, blog posts, apps, conference talks, you name it. Some of these I've only thought about, some of these I wrote down, for some I even talked to people, and some of them I started implementing. And believe it or not, some of them I even completed. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, and I'm sure for many of you it's not, at least not yet. Maybe because you're just getting started with Scala and open source, maybe side projects aren't really your thing, or maybe you just value your work-life balance more than I do. But whatever your background is, Scala or non-Scala, technical or non-technical, I hope you find something in this talk that sticks with you for a while and maybe teaches you something or changes your perspective a little bit. Today I'm here to share my experience from these 10 years. I will start by sharing stories of 3 projects that I worked on in my free time. For each of them, I'll explain what I was trying to achieve, what actually ended up happening, and what I learned in the process about Scala, working on open source, and myself. And finally, I will talk about how my approach to side projects has changed over time, and about what I now think is a healthy, sustainable, and balanced way to work on them. So let's get to it. The first one is Flawless. Flawless was a library for testing. I started it in 2019. My goal for it was to allow the user to treat tests with the same respect and kind of similarly to any other application in a functional style. You would have your own entry points to the tests, and you would run them yourself. The library would give you an API to do it, but how and when you use it, that would still be up to you. For example, here's the entry point, the main class of Flawless's own tests. I was heavily dogfooding here, not even using any other framework. So if no tests were running and they passed, then OK. It heavily prioritized using the functional patterns. It had tests as values instead of side-effecting registration. Test and test suite registration was also explicit. No magic for auto-discovery. It had explicit resource management, so you could control when your resources get allocated and cleaned up on any level. So you could have a resource within the test suite, between a couple suites, and between all of them, completely up to you. And it had a custom UI for test progress, so it wasn't just integrated into SBT and so on. You'll see that on one of the next slides. And it was meant to be a minimal library, not a huge framework. At the time, there was a lot of criticism for libraries like Scala test because they had multiple styles of assertions and a rich assertion DSL. I wanted to avoid that. I worked on Flawless for on and off for about 2 years, but eventually I stopped. The main reason is that I started focusing too much on an assertion DSL, which kind of went against the principles of a minimal library. Also, the other libraries, some of them, started following these principles, some of these principles. We started seeing Weaver, Callicrine, ZeoTest. All of them showed up around the same time as Flawless. And eventually, people doing FP in Scala just mostly decided to use Weaver or Zeo, and sometimes a Munit Katz effect. So the need for Flawless and my motivation for it kind of evaporated. But this project taught me a lot. For example, I finally found a practical use case for path-dependent types in the reporting feature. This was what powered this visualization. I wish I could. I probably can loop this. Sorry, this tool doesn't handle that very well. But I want to show you again. Hold on. So you can see that the number of dots grows at some point. I'll get back to this in a moment. So from the library's point of view, the number of test suites that are present could change while the process was running, because if a set of suites depended on a resource, they would initially count as just one test suite, and then they would get expanded after that resource was available. So here, 1 grows into 50. Okay? And when a test suite appeared, I would generate a unique identifier for it, for every test suite. And when a test suite got expanded into more suites, I would replace that identifier in this list that gets rendered with the list of new identifiers I just generated. Thing is, these identifiers were never displayed anywhere, and really nobody except the generator had to know what type they were. So I made that a type member on the right-hand side, a type member of the generator, and that allowed me to use any type I wanted inside. And the outside didn't have to know what that is, it just referred to the type member. I actually had at least 3 implementations of such a generator, kind of due to bad design, but still it was possible thanks to this. And they used different types for this, like one had an int, one was a cats effect unique, and one even had unit. It was for my own testing. I didn't care about identifiers here. In hindsight, this was probably not a great design decision, but it was a great way to become familiar with that feature in a practical setting. Moving on, in an early version of Flawless, tests were represented by a recursive data type, which was parameterized by a type constructor, making it a higher kind of type. Why did I want recursive tests? No idea. But I had a bunch of transformations on these test values as I was executing them or doing things. And they were starting to become a little bit repetitive in the part that dealt with recursion. So I started looking into recursion schemes because they promised to solve that. But when you reach for recursion schemes, the first time, you probably use something like fix, which operates on the type constructor and not on a higher kind of type. And at this time, we didn't have ChatGPT, so I had to do my digging myself. So I did. And after some digging, I did find someone doing it with higher kind of types in Haskell, and I took that approach to my project. And very quickly, as soon as I showed this to a living soul, as opposed to a Haskell programmer, I realized that it was a lot of complexity that this project didn't need. But the lessons from learning recursion schemes enough to be able to port this higher kind of hfix to Scala will stay with me or haunt me for a long time. But aside from these purely technical learnings, I also had some other takeaways from this. Some of the ideas in Flawless were pretty controversial at the time, and as it turns out, they still are. After using it in another doomed project, I came to the realization that a lot of what Flawless allowed, like the kind of precise control over resources or control over what runs in parallel and doesn't on also a granular level, and other advantages of this value-oriented design were really not worth the added complexity that, the added effort that it now took to actually write a test. Because with great power comes great API complexity. I used to dogmatically believe the assumptions that I had made early on in the project, such as automated test registration is bad because I don't have control, or test registration as a side effect is bad because I want my tests to be values and I want to write middleware for them and I want to transform them. But in practice, these things that I wanted to abolish so bad turned out to actually be quite useful. In a typical project, you don't need the kind of control that I was aiming for. Resources don't need to be shared between like 2 or 3 suites. You just make them global or local to one test suite, and that's enough. Tests as values are also nice in theory, but in my experience, they were just inconvenient. It was harder to move them around or comment out, refactor in any way. It was just clunky. And because every suite had to be registered by hand, the library sort of discouraged you from creating more, because it was just too much effort. So it was doing the opposite of what a good testing library should do, which is make you write more tests. And yes, this could be detected with some tooling, but that's additional complexity and more setup steps, and just another step towards a framework, the very thing I wanted to avoid in the first place. On top of all of this, because there was a custom entry point, Flawless didn't even try to integrate with the SBT testing interface, which all the other testing libraries do. And this, not using it, would have caused its own set of problems and limitations. And all of this has been a massive lesson in pragmatism. Before Flawless, a couple of years ago, I was a diehard FP fan. And to some extent, I still am. But it's much less one-sided. Back then, I couldn't imagine writing another app with side effects. Maybe all it took was getting some practical experience with Flawless, and also with like value, explicit registration of tests from ZeroTest, because I think it still has that. But maybe it was that experience, or maybe I just had been blinded by the pursuit of something new, shiny, and different. But something changed over time. I started seeing trade-offs where I used to see something as absolutely flawless. To this day, I still have some strong opinions, but I'm becoming more and more conscious about weighing the benefits and drawbacks of technical decisions. Maybe one day I even stop hating JavaScript. So yeah, it's important to be pragmatic, practical, and honest with yourself and everyone else about the trade-offs of your choices. The other lesson is that when your project no longer serves a purpose, it's okay to kill it. Sometimes its legacy will live on, you'll make a talk about it, or you'll just take what you learned and apply it somewhere else, or someone else will. The second project, Advent of Code videos. For those of you who don't know, Advent of Code is a yearly event taking place in December. Every day through December, like until 24th, you get a new task, which usually requires some programming. There's parsing, algorithmic thinking, writing simulations, and working with imaginary hardware involved. In 2021, I decided to publish videos of my attempts. I wanted to show my thought process, how I solved the tasks with Scala, and some useful FP patterns that I used along the way. For the very first day's challenge, I published the video on the same day. I explained every change and decision as voiceover on a recording of how I actually solved it. So I was recording why I solved it, then I just added sound. Easy. It went well. But I did notice that the editing and publishing took quite a bit of time. So on the following days, I started grouping the solutions together in one video to avoid the extra overhead of editing and publishing. And also to save time, because the videos were getting quite lengthy, I was just playing back the solution at higher speed and recording voiceover of just the high-level descriptions of what I did or what interesting pattern I had used. But by days 10 to 13, I would only record an explanation of the final solution. There was no time in the video for all that thought process. And I didn't go through the individual steps anymore. And at this point, I was already long behind schedule as well. December 13, that was the task, and I published this video on the 28th of December. And it was hard enough to do the tasks, and the last few I didn't even finish, but the rest, recording, editing, publishing the videos, while having a full-time job and also trying to have some personal time, any personal time, it was straight up impossible for me. And I felt massive guilt about not delivering these videos on time. I was disappointed in myself, and imposter syndrome was at an all-time high, because I felt like I should have been able to solve these tasks much more quickly, with less trouble, because after all, I had so much experience with programming, right? And the quality of the videos was getting worse and worse. Viewership went down as the hype was dying off, because it was almost January, and so much time was passing, and I simply didn't enjoy any of this anymore, maybe except for the brief moment when I pressed publish on each video. But in reality, the type of tasks in Advent of Code has little to do with developing your average microservice or working on like SBT, build tools, whatever, which is what most of my experience is. It's more like lead code. It's literally competitive programming. There is actually a leaderboard, right? For like people doing it in 3 minutes, what takes you or me 2 hours, right? And it's a completely different set of problems as well, which requires a different set of skills. And it's natural that I wouldn't be as good at it as my usual thing. But I didn't think of it this way. And time was going by, and I eventually gave up after 1 more month on January 26th. I published a video about the whole thing, and to my surprise, the reception was very positive. Many people related to my experience and the difficulty of these tasks for a normal programmer. Or at the very least, they understood me, and I felt so validated for this decision, and so relieved. Truth be told, I felt much better before I even finished recording this. Because I had finally prioritized what actually mattered to me, like enjoying what I do, and having free time that allowed me to rest and not having to think about the next day's solution and the next all day, every day. And it was just encouraging to see that showing my viewers, who in some ways looked up to me, even though I'm not a popular YouTuber, they did, that regardless of my experience or having a YouTube channel, I was just like them. Suddenly I had flaws, limitations, and just because I had a YouTube channel with whatever number of subscribers, I wasn't this fearless, indestructible 10x developer content machine who could do anything. And at the end of the day, I am just another guy, and maybe just someone needed to hear that. Summing up, this project's takeaways are more on the non-technical side. Knowing when to stop and give up for your own sanity. Just make sure things you spend on give you joy. Talk about your ups and your downs. Keep it real. Share your failures as well as your successes. And it may help other people feel better about their own shortcomings. Now, the last project of today, before we move on to the next part, is Smithy Transcoder. It's a very recent one. I did it a little more than a month ago, which is a time when I should have had this talk ready, but you know how it is. I actually did rewrite the plan for this talk like 4 times. But it's recent. This project is recent, so by the time I started, I had already learned some of these lessons that I'm talking about. And if there was one thing I knew, it was that I had the talk to give next month, so I couldn't spend forever on this. I also knew that the more time I would spend, the less exciting it would become, so I needed to be quick. Which is why I set a very limited scope for it, just one main feature. I wanted to let the user see how a given Smithy schema would affect the encoding of their data in various formats supported by Smithy 4S. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I gave a talk about Smithy and Smithy 4S 2 years ago here. I started the project, implemented the feature that I considered the most important, didn't even spend much time on the UI, as you can clearly see, because it didn't matter to me, and I finished it in about a week. And I know it was just in time before I lost motivation. Does it work? Yes. Is it done? Probably not. You could still add many, many features to such a tool. And who knows, maybe one day I will. Maybe I'll get a sudden urge to get back to it and develop it further. But for all intents and purposes, it's feature complete today. The takeaways from this one are that setting a clear, realistic goal from day one helps me stay focused and not get distracted by other projects or unimportant features. And it is satisfying to complete a project after all, and it gives you something to share. But even if you fail or don't complete something, you can still share these things as well. I have told you the lessons I learned from working on these 3 projects, but over all that time, I learned so much more. I also want to talk about that. So as we're approaching the end of the talk, I would like to tell you about some guidelines that I'm trying to follow now, which help me maintain a healthy balance of challenge and fun and the success to failure ratio. But I want to point out that most of it is just vibes and not vibe coding. No. I know the guidelines are there, but they are not hard rules. And it goes without saying, but this is extremely subjective. It works for me and it may not work for you. And I'm aware some of it is obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, so I hope it's not obvious to everyone. I do it for myself. It's easier for me to focus on something if I believe in it, and if I have intrinsic motivation to put in the effort. So I need something to gain. And external inputs may influence what I feel is important to others, and that may affect my own perception of what is important. Like if something is important to the community, that's good for me to know, and maybe it'll change my mind, but ultimately it's still up to what matters to me. If I don't have that drive, I won't be able to keep going for long. You saw what happened with Smithy Transcoder. I did what was valuable to me, and I did it on time. And apparently I didn't care enough about any other features, so I just didn't add them. But you also saw what happened with Flawless. I didn't believe in the project anymore, so I stopped working on it. After all, these are things I do in my free time, so it should be something that brings me joy. I can't do it all. I have 6 of these lessons. I can't do it all. If you're the type of person who gets new ideas faster than you can execute them, you will never catch up with your own imagination. It's just a fact. And that's okay, but for me, it took a lot of time and a significant change in the mindset to accept it. I had to stop treating my list of ideas as a to-do list or a queue. Now it's just a list of ideas. And I no longer write new ideas down to prioritize them. I just do it so that I don't stress about forgetting them and so that I can focus on whatever I was doing before, and also that I can fall asleep sometimes. But also I can note any details about them, which may be useful later. Don't steal these ideas. Stop taking pictures. They're mine. No, but really, if you want to work on something from this list, feel free to do so. Just tell me that you're doing it. Back to the list. But yeah, just like putting thoughts into this digital paper helps me sleep. And someday I can look at that list again, and maybe one of the points grabs my attention for longer. But there's another reason why I don't simply jump to that new idea, which is the next rule: one thing at a time. I only allow myself to have one bigger project open at a time, or try to. This is just vibes after all. Context switching is just too expensive, and this is the only way that I find that I am able to accomplish anything bigger than, say, a 2-hour contribution. But sometimes there's still more, there's multiple things I want to work on without having to wait for one to be completed or killing it. So I allow myself an exception. I allow myself to switch my current big project, but no more than once a week. And one of two things usually happens. Either I only work on these things on the weekends, so that just removes my ability to switch any more often. Or sometimes I stick to one thing for longer, like multiple weeks, because I do have that drive, so I don't want to switch anyway. And it works. But maybe 1 week is not enough, maybe I need to make it 2, maybe I will. I can adjust these rules. These are, you don't have to be so strict with your own rules. But still, having that lower bound means that I actually get to complete some projects that I maybe don't want to work on so much before I jump to the latest idea, the new shiny object. So it gives me a reason to push myself, but just ever so slightly, without, stressing over it. Celebrate completion. I try to focus on what I've already achieved, rather than focusing on the infinite list of things that remain to be done, which is why I had the audacity to submit a talk like this. And to be honest, I wish I had this mindset long ago, because when preparing this talk, I even had trouble listing all the projects I started or finished. So I opened my IDE, started writing some Scala scripts to capture that information and do something with it, and I actually gave up even on that idea. Hell, the whole concept of this talk has changed several times since I started. Which leads me to the next point. Embrace failure. Sometimes you will fail. At least I will. That's a given. And it's important to admit that, and also important to know when a project has failed and needs to go. Wow, talk about rhyme. Like I said, I want to work on things that bring me joy. But I'm not saying that you should abandon every project as soon as it starts to become difficult, or you no longer feel like doing it, because the difficult parts are how we learn, how we evolve. For example, running Scala on the Playdate, something I showed here last year. If I killed the project every time I didn't enjoy something, I never would have managed to reach the goal. But I had an end goal in mind, and the excitement of doing it, of being the first person to do this, helped me stay focused, because it was such a cool thing to do. Still, it's good to keep in mind how a project makes you feel. And when it no longer gives you what you wanted from it, it may be time to stop. It's still better than procrastinating on one project forever while you could be doing other projects which you would be more successful at. And last but not least, I define the goal. This relates to the first guideline, which was that I do it for myself. The goal of your project doesn't always have to be a complete working product, like an app or a library. Sometimes you just want to learn or experiment, and these are equally valid reasons to start. I do this all the time. And you don't need to know what the goal is from the very beginning. It's your call when you decide that a particular project should just be a learning experience. As I'm finishing this talk, I just want to have one more cringy quote, which is that sometimes maybe the real treasure really is the friends we make along the way. I know, right? Here are some links for the resources I referred to or that inspired me. You can find the slides online on my socials. And if you'd like any help in finding a project to work on, don't use that list before, but feel free to get in touch, and I will try to help. And this is all I have. Thank you very much for your time.